Hey, welcome to Fathering Our Future, the podcast for dads. I'm Anthony Vandegrift, and I'm not the perfect dad, but every day I am trying to be better. I'm very excited to have with me once again Dr. Jim Littles. Jim, thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I will say this before we jump into that, though. For anyone who has not listened to the first interview that we did, I would highly encourage you to go and do that, especially if you are a Christian. I have to say that our discussion was my favorite discussion that I've had up to this point, and I don't always go back and listen to the episodes that I produce and put out, but I've gone back and listened to that one at least 4 or 5 times. So much that you contributed to the conversation. And the funny thing was, I got home and I was just like, still dumbfounded. And I told my wife, I said, I had a title in mind, but it's just not good enough. And I told her, I said, I want to title this How to Be a Dad and a Christian. like you can't do it right if you're not doing it this way. But I think I opted for what Christian dads need to hear. So if you haven't listened to that episode, please go do yourself a favor and listen to that. But today, we are going to talk about something that is very important, and that is how child development impacts our fathering. Now, being a dad is one of those things that men have done since the beginning of time. And I think there's a lot of people like myself that even though it can be filled with its complexities, if they could do it, and so can I. And you just think you can manage to work your way through it. But the more I think about that, the more I push back against that thinking, because we're doing something that's pretty significant. It's pretty important. We are, in fact, fathering our future. The impact that we make on our children in the homes is going to carry with them as they go out into the world, and our impact will eventually impact those that they build relationships with themselves. So I believe that, yeah, you can get through it, but why would we just want to do that? So if we're going to do a great job, one of the things that we can be aware of is their developmental process, what they're going to go through and what they're going to experience. My wife and I used a particular app. I include myself because I was the dad, but she's the one who really used the app for our children when they were born. So this got us from newborn stage until about 2 years old. But it would send us notifications and it would give us updates based on when they were having particular leaps as children. Like, this is the week that your child will start seeing colors instead of everything in black and white. So you can expect this and this and this. Or this week is going to be a really tough week for them. You're going to see a sleep regression. The nice thing about that was when we knew what to expect and we had good expectations, we could properly plan for that. And it wasn't, this is a disaster and the chaos is just too much, because we knew it was going to be very chaotic. So having good and proper expectations based off understanding what your child is going through, it helps. It helps significantly. So that is what we're going to attempt to do today. We're going to understand the best that we can various phases of our children's development and how we can then adjust our plan as fathers to meet the needs that are present. So I can only speak to this a little bit because my oldest is 6, so that's my experience basically goes up to that point. Now, for everyone who might not know, again, you're a PhD in family studies, and you've been there and you've done that. So you actually,
my oldest is 41,
yes.
So a little bit of difference.
So you've got the experiences, you've been through the phases, and you have the experience to go right along with the education. So help us navigate the big phases. And I understand that this is a very open-ended question, but right. I'll poke and probe along the way. But navigate the big phases of our children's development so that we can get better expectations and have better practices as fathers.
Sure. A couple of framing comments, if I can, before we
Absolutely.
jump into that. One is I believe parents should work out of a feeling of competence and not incompetence. Unfortunately, in a world that has an expert for tying your shoes to roofing your house, it looks like you need 17 people just to get your family out of bed and on the school bus in the morning. So we want to make sure that we're not coming from a position of I can't do this. Instead, we're coming from the position of I can do this. So from a position of competence, not incompetence. Secondly, you mentioned using an app, and there are so many digital resources available, just simple searches on the web about developmental, and you'll get all the resources that you need. I'd like to mention that this is a shift from most of human history. Most of human history, this was done by storytellers or wise men and women in a village, and villages were typically smaller communities, kinds of things, but the importance of storytellers. The storytellers could link today with the ancients, those that had gone by. And so even though it'll be important to see some of these pivotal developmental pieces, I think it's vital for parents to not do this alone. And yes, you can use technology as aids, but the greatest aid that you have is the aid of community and relationships.
Sure.
And unfortunately, many people say, well, my family was all messed up, so I don't even know what to do. Well, every family has its messed up pieces in it.
You are not alone.
When I was a Bible college instructor years ago teaching a human development course, one of the students came to me and said, Brother Littles, I don't think I should ever get married. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, I was abused as a child, and the statistics are is that I will be an abuser. And I said, well, wait a minute, you're not reading the statistic properly. And second of all, statistics aren't determinative of your behavior. So I had to back him up and let him know that, yes, statistically, an abused person is more likely to abuse a child than a non-abused person. But a majority of people who are abused do not become child abusers. So at the first blush, it would look like, wow, if I had abuse as a child, then I should make sure that I don't have children to perpetuate that on the world. No, you're more likely than an unabused person. However, you can also use that as a springboard to great parenting.
Sure, absolutely.
And so being in relationship with others. So when we talk about developmental stages, the app that you had for up to 2 is probably going to be better than one from, say, 15 to 17 years old, because the beginning of life, there are more commonalities. And then as children grow and develop, due to family, due to even genetic codes in their body, as you know, having more than one child, they are not carbon copies.
Amen.
So as we're looking at this, we've got to make sure we're realizing that these are averages. These are kind of ballpark norms. And if your child isn't walking by 13 months, don't get freaked out that my child has a problem here. Most children will be walking by 12 months. Right. Some children will walk at 9 months. Now, don't sign them up with the New York Yankees, because now they have a body kinesthetic intelligence is what that's called. You can't determine kinesthetic intelligence at 9 months old. But there's going to be this wide range from 9 months to 12, 13, 14 months. Same way with speech. Some children are going to use words very early, making sentences even very early, and others may delay till they're 2 or 3 years old.
Sure.
So don't automatically get freaked out by those pieces.
I think that's a really good thing. I'll just comment real fast, because we had a very similar situation to what you just dealt with. Our son didn't really speak until right after he turned 2, and he was speaking a little bit. You know, the mama, dada, he was doing that early on before 12 months, but 12 months came around and just stopped, just went away. And so our big concern was, I guess the cultural concern is he on the spectrum?
Yeah.
And so we start, going down this avenue. Well, he had hearing problems. So as soon as we had his tonsils and adenoids removed and put tubes in his ears, within 3 weeks, he was just like, you need to shut up, kid. And so that really, kind of worried us. But I think that's reassuring to hear that, look, there's a big
wide
window.
Range.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and some children will point instead of talking. And if you automatically jump in and do what they're pointing to, you're going to slow down their oral skills. So eventually you say, well, if you'll ask what you want for it, I'll get it for you. But pointing for the glass of milk isn't going to get you a glass of milk anymore.
Right.
So there are small things that you can do along the way like that. Another piece is thinking of how do you think of your job as a parent? So as we are looking at these developmental skills, we are not looking at them like components of an automobile. So we have an engine, and so we need an engine expert, and we have transmissions, so we need a transmission expert. We have windshield wipers, so we need windshield wiper experts. We're not breaking down children into discrete pieces that are separated, and we want to become an expert in those 5 areas. Instead, we want to see it as a socialization process. For Christians, we're going to call this discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
For the general community, they're going to call it socialization. How do I prepare a child that is equipped and ready to handle their tasks? Dads who are listening to this podcast, let's say their child's 2 years old, you are wanting, this is going to be freaky, but you're wanting them to be successful men and women in the year 2060 and 70.
Yeah.
When I think of 2022 and the stuff that's going on now, and I think out 50 years, you want them to be successful at 2070. Well, they're not even going to be my age my age I am now. By then, I will be very successful at pushing up daisies. But 50 years from now, that's what you're equipping them for.
Yeah.
So at the first, that creates an anxiety of, oh no, how in the world can I instill competencies and moral fiber to an extent, and an emotional stability? How can I instill these things to an extent that a world 50 years from now, which futurists, it always amazes me of how much they know about the future until you get there and then they realize how far off.
Not quite.
The one guy that nails it, he gets all the spread about the one prophecy that he had right. There's no conversations about all of the missed futurist pieces.
Right.
Just a couple of years ago, they were prophesying within 10 years, every car would have to be auto driving or you wouldn't be able to get insurance. Now, the latest stuff the last week or two is, wow, did Silicon Valley really blow this one? We're not going to have automatic cars anytime soon. So thinking of this, we're looking down the road with a spirit of competence in a community. And as Christians, I'll describe that as discipleship. So when a child misbehaves, discipline does not mean whip, whoop, have or has whooping. Discipline means to form them as a disciple. And that strategy of discipline will look different for an 18-month-old than it will for an 18-year-old. Can't use the same strategies because the developmental state at which they are is different.
Sure.
I think it's appropriate to smack a child's hand, now not abusively, but to get a child's attention if they're putting their finger into an electrical socket.
Sure.
You don't want them to have the experience to learn from that. You want to circumvent having the experience to do so. So we're going to think of it in terms of we're preparing men and women for long after we are gone. And so that's why this is, as you mentioned, such a critical task. We are not making them in our image. That was one of the things, my major learning point I had as a dad, is that my children had their competencies, their skills. And if I respected their competency and skills, then I would be able to prepare them for what they needed to be, not to build page 3 of my resume.
Sure. Yeah.
Otherwise, you wind up saying, well, I happen to have a doctorate and a couple master's degrees. Well, my kids have to have. And my first child was the one that helped me learn, Dad, you need to see me.
Yeah.
Not see me through you. And so Jennifer, a special mother with 2 sons, one's 20 and the other one's 17, both taller than I am. She's done a great job as a mom.
Yeah.
Didn't go to college. For me, I was, when she was growing up, with my understanding of development and gender, whenever she would say she wanted to be a nurse, I would say, well, why don't you be the doctor? Because I don't want them to limit.
Sure.
Because of societal limits. I was wanting to free that up, but I didn't realize I was also creating anxiety. Just because she could do those things doesn't mean that was the right thing for her. So this is how we have to know our children. So we're going to look at developmental pieces, but then we have to know our child.
Yeah. Wow.
Because our child is not a paint by number, where all these little pieces fit together and they all come out looking well if I get it all right. So you're not going to get it all right. And you started off by saying you're not a perfect dad. And if that's our goal, we should not have children, because the quest for perfection in ourselves and perfection in our children will perpetuate very harmful behaviors. But if we can build a culture of grace and forgiveness,
Sure.
which means we don't get it all right, and we're willing to repent of it, then we're in a place where socialization can happen. So I think those are very critical for understanding children's development, those big contexts in which this happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that really needs to be your context approach in that conversation. Otherwise, like you said, you're setting yourself up for misery, essentially.
Yep.
You will never achieve what you have in your mind to achieve.
Right. And it's also arrogant thinking that I know what 2070 is going to look like. I don't. I was born in 1961. My parents were born in the middle of the war, World War II. And so they were the first generation really to grow up after the war, and I was the tail end of the baby boomers. There's no way my young parents in 1961 knew what skills I would need now in the 2020s.
Oh, sure.
So that's an ultimate of arrogance. So instead, we build competencies and flexibility into our children. So as they encounter new things, they can say, well, I got this. I've learned stuff before. Right. That's what development is about. We're building competencies at each stage so that when they get to the next task, they have some successes behind them that give them, instead of a fear of the next change, a sense of competence. I don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but I can navigate it.
Right.
That's what we really want to build into our children by understanding their developmental pieces.
Yeah. Wow, that's critical. Okay, well, let's start down the path of the developmental phases, I guess we can dub it as that.
We're going to think in several broad categories.
Okay.
There's the physical pieces, what they do biologically, and this is the walking piece, that kind of thing. We're going to think of cognitive pieces. How is their brain forming and developing? So the development, for instance, of an infant is going to be more in the age of what's called sensory motor. Child, this is why oral stage. This is why the child grabs something, sticks it in their mouth, because that's how they make sense of the world. So they sense things by touching, feeling, hearing through the senses. Our goal is, by the time they reach adolescence, is that they're moving into what's called formal operations. And now you really sense this is happening, the formal operation, this last stage, according to Jean Piaget. This last stage is when children all of a sudden can think in theories and big ideas. I always have to laugh when I listen to conversations of high school students talking about climate change or economic crises, because if the world would just give them control, they would have it fixed within 3 months.
Sure.
The glaciers would grow back. All exhaust would be gone. Everybody would live in circles and sing Kumbaya every night. There'd be no more war, no more violence. And the reason this is the case is their brain has just gone to a new level where they can understand theory. They can think theoretically. However, they don't have any life experiences to pull it off.
Sure.
So when they start thinking that way, don't poo-poo it and say, no, that's not there. You have to help walk with them so that your experience plays into their element. Now, there are two primary ways of thinking of cognitive development. One is, what can the child do on their own? So there's some fun things Piaget would have them do, which is, say, conservation of number. With conservation of number, you would have 5 pennies, and beneath that, 5 donuts or whatever. And if you line them up perfectly, which is more, the pennies or the donuts? Well, everybody knows those are exactly the same. There are 5. But if you take the donuts and stretch them out, or the pennies and stretch them out, all of a sudden now, whichever line is longer, there's more. And same with conversation of volume. If you take your cup, you have 2 cups, the exact same size, clear, so they can see. Yes, that's the same. But if you take one of those and pour it into a tall beaker, that beaker has more in it than the other cup does. So the child hasn't, and that's going to happen about the age of 4 or 5, that's going to kick in. So before that, you don't expect them to understand conservation of number, conservation of mass, conservation of volume. Now, there's some things that parents can do. Sorting socks is a great pre-math activity. Okay, sorting socks, fantastic academic journey. This is the beginning. This is the stuff astronauts are made out of, is sorting socks.
That's all it does.
This is it. So this is not slave labor, getting your kids to sort socks. This is helping developing their cognitive skills, because they've got some major tasks we got to do here. We got to do grouping.
Okay.
These are daddy socks. These are mommy socks. These are big brother socks, and these are your socks. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to group them. Now, whose do you think this one? You think mommy can wear that? No, you silly daddy. Mommy can't wear that. That's mine. You have lost your mind. And now the child thinks they are taking care of you.
Right.
They don't know what senility is, but if they did, that's the word that would come to mind. So you're grouping those socks into these four piles.
Yeah.
Daddy socks, mommy socks, big brother socks, my socks. And then you get to group them inside by colors or shapes or style, or however you choose to do that. And it's so funny. One math teacher was using these plastic geometric shapes in their class. I think it was like kindergarten, first grade kind of thing. So I want you to sort these stacks. And they had differences of colors and differences of shapes. And the expectation is, now the directions were, sort these geometric shapes, geometric tiles. Those are the instructions. Sort them. So the child sorted them, and the child didn't put green and blue and red, or they didn't put triangles and circles and, by sides. Mm-hmm. And so the teacher is confused. And no, you didn't sort them. Oh, yeah, I did. Well, explain to me. How did you sort these? I like these and I don't like these. So the child had done exactly what was asked.
Sure.
But their cognitive place wasn't in terms of color, wasn't in terms of size, wasn't in terms of shape. It's I like and I don't like.
Yeah.
So, but this is the stuff that astronauts are made out of. We are beginning to help develop the mind and thinking in terms of matching. Now, these are also going to be pre-literacy skills. Noting shapes and colors. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that are going to develop into literacy later. So reading happens long before children are learning the alphabet.
Wow.
Okay, so that's one way to think of cognitive development, is in terms of what can they do and what can they not do.
Okay.
That's Jean Piaget, a Swiss child psychologist. On the other hand, there's a Russian psychologist writing at the early to mid 20th century, Vygotsky. And for him, it wasn't near as interesting to see what a child could or could not do on their own. For him, coming from a more collectivist society, the question is what can this child do with assistance? So this is where we get the scaffolding idea. We're going to build a scaffold around the child to help them develop skills. And a great example of this is mom or dad making pancakes. Mm-hmm. So I think, just by the way, I think it's a great tradition for dads to have a breakfast tradition of some sort.
Saturday morning pancakes.
Saturday morning pancakes. The menu doesn't have to be large,
right?
But it's a place for you to spend some time with your kids and
Absolutely.
to smile and laugh and tell stories and clean up messes without berating them for getting stuff all over the place.
Yep.
By helping them know cleaning up messes is a part of life, you are positioning them for success down the road.
It's a big lesson in that.
As opposed to saying, we got to make sure this place stays spotless because mama not going to be happy. We're going to get it back to semi-mommy standard when we're done.
Right.
But between everything being perfectly mommy standard and us getting breakfast and then near mommy standard, because we never get to mommy standard.
Sure.
Near mommy standard when we're done, there's going to be some flour and spilt milk and laughter.
Yep.
And we're not going to get angry. We're not going to, because there'll be seasons of frustrations that are there because the child wants to be able to do it and do it well and make you proud, because that's part of development for the child. The psychosocial pieces. I want my daddy to be proud of me. And, oh no, look at that. And these are, at times, dads will then need to make a mistake of their own, not to belittle the child, but to help the child realize, this is so good. And man, that pancake, I can't wait till the next one comes out. Let's see what shape is in that one.
Yeah.
And then you can have the child discover shapes there, just like you do when you're laying in the backyard at night in the summer, looking up at the clouds or the stars and identifying shapes and seeing things. You're doing that in the pancakes as you're getting ready. And then getting ready to take care of mommy, because mommy takes care of us a whole lot. Now, I'm using some gender stereotypings, obviously, but for many families, moms do a lot of that kind of stuff. So we want to make sure we're taking care of mommy. This is your chance, because we're wanting to build in children a sense of competence. This is part of the psychosocial development that comes from Erik Erikson. But before we get there, I'm just going to go back and say cognitively, we're going to look at it in both ways.
Okay.
How do we develop? How do we know where they are? Okay, so the child that's sensing things by grabbing stuff, putting it in their mouth, yes, we're going to baby-proof our house so that they are not swallowing small parts, putting their heads in plastic bags or any of those kinds of things. But we are also recognizing that putting things in their mouth is vital. That's how they will learn. And then as those stages go on, pre-operational stage from 2 to 7, so they're starting to go to school, start to see the world through language and mental images. The language development cannot impress on the podcast listeners how much expanding the brain is happening during this time. Now, I don't buy into the theories, well, human beings only use 10% of their brain. I would love to know how in the world some guy comes up with these crazy statistics.
That reminds me of I've said this many times on the podcast, and I hate it so much, but someone came up with this statistic and it just caught fire that 95% of being a dad is just being there. No, it's not. Who came up with that? Like,
quality time.
So you're home. That counts. But these statistics that just come out of nowhere.
It's amazing. But during this time, the brain is gaining its greatest mass. And part of it is putting what's called myelin sheathing on the nerves. It's gaining weight, gaining mass, and it's being developed by speech. Speech is really driving that and mapping the mind in other ways. Now, you mentioned earlier fear of spectrum kinds of things. Instead of self-diagnosing your children, I think it is good to have a physician that you can trust.
Sure.
To help you with that. Now, I know there are some parents who I don't want it to wind up on their record someplace that they're on the Asperger's, for instance.
Right.
I had a seminary student, a graduate student, who was afraid of getting labeled as on the spectrum, and he had Asperger's. The challenge was if he had known and his mother had known, he could have maximized, his mother could have helped maximize his skills, because Asperger's is one of those where there's some challenges, but there's also some great blessings that can come from the ability to focus. Mm-hmm. So many people, Elon Musk perhaps is the most famous Asperger, or at least I think he has Asperger's.
That's what he claims.
And he acts like it, and he tweets like it. We will, from time to time, now historically, these would be wise men and women in the village. Mm. Now we call them doctors and we give them lots of money. But human beings over time have always had wise men and women in the village to help us to see what's on target and what's not on target. So in those checkups, the physicians can do some checkups. And if they think there's a challenge, they'll send you to a specialist in that area. But don't go in with anxiety. But if there is a challenge there, what that will do is we'll say, now what is normal for everybody else isn't going to be normal for my child. So after you go through your grieving and lament piece, because my child isn't going to be that astronaut probably, may own Tesla, but he's not probably going to be an astronaut or have good social skills because of some of the other stuff. Then you got to develop a new normal. So we're developing a normal for this child. I don't think we want to do that always for every child, because now we are trying to treat that child as an individual disconnected from everyone. Children are not raised to be disconnected. We are not even raising individuals. That's why it's called a socialization process. We're raising someone that functions in society.
Right.
and function, and it's going to be able to grow and function in a society 50 years from now, 70 years from now. We want them to be able to function there. So we are going to pay attention to norms. We are going to pay attention to relationships, going to pay attention to communities. But if there is some abnormality, wow, something that is not normal in a child's cognitive or physical development, we want to find out and get the help that they can, because some of those things of earlier intervention can offset some of the challenges that are going to come later on. Some of the things we know about speech development in children comes from people who were deprived of the opportunity to speak through horrible cases of abuse or abandonment or whatever they were. And some children who don't have an opportunity to learn to speak till they're 7 or 8 may never develop the ability to speak.
Wow. Because
there's so much that's happening in the brain. So there's these things that are happening at these gate pieces. I don't say that to make you anxious, but just to realize that these are the quote unquote normal pieces in the range. And if somebody's on some edge of the range other than that, then get help and intervention where they can. So for cognitive development, for Piaget on the individual level, sensory motor, then pre-operational, learning to think through languages and images, then concrete, thinking in categories, and then formal operations where they can do hypothetical and scientific reasoning. So to create a hypothesis, you can't do that till junior high school because theoretical reasoning isn't available.
Wow.
At 5 or 6 years old, 7, 8, 9 years old. You can have them think in categories. You can have them think about things that are on the table. So if you're wanting them to learn science kinds of thing, it's very hands-on experiment. And of course, the greatest science lab in the world, I've already mentioned it, the kitchen, is the greatest place for measurement and all of those kinds of things. We're going to put 3 teaspoons. So what's that? Well, this is a teaspoon and this is a tablespoon. So we need teaspoons. We're going to go with the little one on this one.
Yeah, I've heard Neil Tyson DeGrasse, I think that's how you say his name, but he's talked about let your kids get into the cabinets and pull the pots and pans out. Yeah. Let them make the sounds. Let them play around. This is their way of experimenting and learning. So yes, the kitchen.
Yep, the kitchen. If you're a dad that is a gearhead and works on cars, take them out there and obviously keep them safe, but do all. I'm by the way, happy National Fountain Pen Day, just in case you weren't aware.
I was not aware.
Today is National Fountain Pen Day. So
there we go.
My grandsons, when they were 3 years old, we had conversations, about my pens versus their pens. So when my granddaughter was born, she's 9 now. I had that conversation with her when she was 6 months old. You may not touch this. But it becomes a joke so that over time, I would buy the little fellow's fountain pens because for me, writing literacy is part of my who I am. So when they think about me, they think about Papa's fountain pens, and they have fountain pens, or someday they will, and they're going to get to write things and draw pictures. And when they do, I'm not going to get out my red one and underline bad spelling because I might be spelling phonetically, but we're going to celebrate those growth pieces. So cognitive formation is one piece.
Okay.
But that's happening at the same time that Erik Erikson's psychosocial development is happening. So the child is developing individual skills while developing relational skills. And these are, we're going to be attending to both of those. Erikson's theory has really made it into the popular thought processes when you mention a midlife crisis. That's using Erikson's language. Now, tragically, they're not using the language appropriately because crisis doesn't mean meltdown in Erik Erikson. Crisis means an opportunity to learn and go to the next stage. So crisis is an opportunity.
That's a big game changer right there.
That is a game changer. Of course, my students didn't always appreciate it when I would give them an opportunity to take a test.
Yeah.
We have an opportunity scheduled for next Friday. Come on, that's a test. No, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to learn and to demonstrate to me how much you learned.
Yeah.
These crises aren't that my child is going to fail or that I'm going to fail. These crises are an opportunity to learn a new skill set.
Sure.
To go to the next level. And we anticipate and we are building into our children an awareness over time that you're going to develop new skills over time. The beginning of those skills are not always easy. I don't think our children, for instance, should be introduced to every single music instrument and be engaged in lessons for every single music instrument.
Sure.
My brother's a musician, has his doctorates in music education, and he teaches in that discipline. He lets me know that any parent who comes and says that their child can play anything, their child can play nothing.
Yeah.
Because that child has not been taught or trained to focus their energies. So the beginning infant stage to 18 months is trust versus mistrust. The greatest learning here is that the world is a trusting place. Now, here's an area where parents have to rethink who they are. Because if we're living in a world that sees everything through fear and anxiety, we're going to perpetuate that and build it into our children. And I think this is why we're getting more and more challenges with children in schools and social experiences, because they are learning fear from their parents.
Wow. Would you relate that to, I don't know that I'll call it a crisis, maybe for lack of a better term I will right now, but the mental health crises, would that carry over as well?
Yes. A cultural mental health, even though the children aren't going to be engaging in the economic world. They don't know the stock market went down 138 points yesterday or whatever the number happens to be. However, if you want to geek out on this, Yuri Bronfenbrenner is the theorist that looks at child development in these concentric circles.
Okay.
So dad's work, for instance, mom's work, where your wife works, impacts your children, although your children don't go to the university where mom works.
Wow.
So, but the university affairs and behaviors have an impact on your kids, not just because they give your wife a paycheck, and not just because of things go well at work, things go well at home. If there's a crisis at work, there's this bleed over between work and home life. And that's a whole field of study in family studies, is the relationship between work and home life. But if we're going to build into our children trust instead of mistrust, we have to make sure we see the world as a trustworthy place, not in a foolish, leave the door open, welcome everybody in. Now, what's amazing to me is we will say, well, let's lock the door, then we'll let the internet bring everything into our house.
That's good.
So we have split the world into places of where I'm afraid of others, but I'm not really afraid of the places where I maybe should be a little more careful.
Sure.
Maybe should be a little more worried about what information comes into our house than do you have 17 locks on your front door with a Ring camera that is able to multi-depth focus, over time. I think we've sometimes put our emphasis in the wrong place. So, for instance, stranger danger has been a part of the American psyche for a good while now. As a Christian, that is un-Christ-like. Because I'm called to love strangers, not be afraid of strangers.
Sure.
Okay, so that's why it's a Christian idea, because it confronts so many things. Because most cultures, you have in-group and out-group behavior. And this is why you have identifiers of speech, identifiers of dress, identifiers of customs, so we can determine who's in my group and who's out of my group. So I'm going to trust people that are in my group. I'm going to distrust people that are outside of my group. All right? So American culture, stranger danger. And we will teach young women, if you're going to the store, make sure you park under the light and make sure you have your pepper spray in hand, and make sure unfortunately, most young women are abused by people they know.
Yeah.
Not by strangers at the mall. Same way with children. We're in a world right now of an anxiety of child shootings. I will say up front that every time there is a child shot in school, it breaks my heart.
Sure.
However, in a year, if there are 4 children that are killed in a year in a school, we want a national referendum on firearms, and we want cops in every corridor of every building. On the other hand, I'm even more heartbroken that there are more than 4 kids killed every week in their home.
Right.
Schools are not the most dangerous place for kids. Homes are.
Yeah.
So as we're building our children and seeing their stages of development, we've got to grasp this first stage of trust versus mistrust, that this is a trustworthy place and that it's safe here and it's okay here. And daddy's not going to come home angry from work and start kicking things. So part of as we are seeing developmental stages in our children, it causes us to be reflective as dads. Are there things in me that didn't get developed properly? Because I don't want to instill that in them. If I think the world is a non-trustworthy place, and if I build that into my children, then according to Eric Erickson, and most psychologists will agree, if these beginning stages of development go sideways, we're setting up challenges down the way.
Sure.
So when it gets to the place where they're wanting intimacy versus isolation, which is roughly 21 to 39-year-olds, the range when they're going to get married,
right?
If that bottom foundation of trust versus mistrust if that crisis isn't met, crisis meaning opportunity to learn trust.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you got potty training happening, you got lots of behaviors that are learning. If I find out when I make a mistake, I get the snot beat out of me, that's going to become an untrustworthy place.
Sure.
If my physical needs, my diaper isn't changed, my bottles, if there's not enough food, or the temperature fluctuates and it's not safe, or if I can't find mama or daddy, if that's missing later on, they are going to have some critical issues. Wow. So each of these, again, we're not going to come with anxiety. We're just coming with awareness. And that's what that app you were talking about. The next one is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Can the child function on their own? This is with the me do it stage. So we're wanting to develop some skills, and you can do that. So for instance, Saturday night, getting ready for church on Sunday morning as a Christian, or if you're a Sabbatarian, Friday night, getting ready for Saturday, whenever it might be. It's a good time when children in these 2 and 3 year old ages, let's get ready for church tomorrow, honey. Do you want to pick out your clothes?
Yeah.
That's a biggie right there.
Yep.
And, they're developing autonomy. They're learning how to do it on their own. If, on the other hand, as a dad, I'm frustrated because I feel incompetent with my life, when it takes them a little while to get their coat on properly, I'm instilling in them a sense of shame. And dads listening, shame is the worst gift you can give your kids. We're not going to tell our kids, shame on you. We're not dispensers of shame. We're dispensers of love and mercy. And for me, personally, comes because Christ has been merciful towards me.
Absolutely.
So we're going to, which means you got to plan more time to get out the door. You know that. When your kids came along, that was the big game changer. You and your wife, the drop of you're out the door.
15 minutes, both of us. Boom, we could do it. Now it's almost 15 days. There's never enough time ahead for us to make it where we need to be.
You can start a new tech company quicker than you can get out of the house.
Yes.
But you're built this. If you see it as a frustrating time for that 3-year-old who wants to put on their own shoes, and for them it's very critical. I get to put my shoes on.
Yes.
And you're saying, but I'm on the keyboard at church tonight. I have to be there. Well, that means you just start with a little extra shoe putting on time. To navigate that journey.
Right.
And will we nail it perfectly every time? No. There'll come times when we don't do it. Well, it just then gives us a great opportunity to confess to ourselves, to our spouse, and to our kids. You're right, baby. You can do that by yourself, and I'm so proud of you. You put on shoes like I've never seen a 3-year-old put on shoes like you. You have such style. Yeah. Even when their shoes are pointing the wrong direction, you help them change it over eventually. Then we get into initiative versus guilt. This is when they start trying on new tasks. And then the next is industry versus inferiority, the 5 to 13-year-old kind. This is where kids get into crafts.
Okay.
And this is a gift for not only dads to make things with their kids. Used to when scouting was a big thing is when you would make the little soapbox cars and little cars that you would race because for children at this age they need to make stuff. Painting, this is where you have lots of resources in the house for them to create and make. And it's also, I think, vital to connect your kids with other adults around, grannies, grandpas, aunts, uncles, good friends,
Sure.
of various colors
Yeah.
and classes to help them realize that there are lots of safe people and they have different skills. So if you're interested in blacksmithing, I know nothing about blacksmithing, but we can find somebody that can show you what that's like.
Yeah.
And this is kind of cool stuff, and you can make. Mommy's been wanting a hook for that pan over there anyway, so you can go make one. So it's a critical piece. Each of these crises stages are setting up. If you pass here, to use academic language, if you successfully navigate that crisis, that sets you up for the next one. And this goes on. The beauty of Erickson's stages is it goes on through adulthood, even and to the end of life issues of what's needed at that time. This is a lot of stuff I'm throwing here.
Yeah.
But fortunately, digitally, a lot of it's available online very quickly. I have to underscore, though, don't get anxious about it. Be inquisitive, not anxious.
Sure. That's good.
Be inquisitive, not anxious. So learn as much as you can, and don't think you're an expert because you read a book on something. Just put it into practice. Try it out. Talk to other dads and moms and grandpas. Grandfathering in our culture, grandparenting in our culture still does not have a social script on what's acceptable. So those are all negotiated. So dads can help their children and their own fathers by building spaces for those relationships. That's going to be part of the trust and part of the competencies that child's going to develop, knowing that they have connections.
Right.
Really challenging in a mobile society where you might be separated long distances.
Sure.
I know we're just about out of time, but I need to mention another domain of development, and that is the moral development.
Okay.
Moral development. And you'll really see this as you're playing games with kids. There is that age with children at which the rules have to be followed completely. You cannot break any rule because that's what the rule says. There are two major theorists I'll bring to mind. The most known one is Lawrence Kohlberg, with stages of moral development and going through, like the second stage is just being a good boy, good girl. That's moral development. I need to be a good boy and a good girl. And that's where moms and dads are going to help. Dads are going to help that child. You are a good boy.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want, of all the boys in the world, of all the girls in the world, if I could pick, it would be you.
Right.
It would be you. And that's important also when our girls are 18, that they're not finding affection from every man they meet.
Sure.
That they've grown up in a home where they know appropriate boundaries of affection with their fathers. And this is why sexual abuse is so damaging. But it's also why dads have such a powerful opportunity to prepare young women for their relationships with other men in the future. And it's going to start early on with this good boy, good girl piece. Dads can help them know you are a good boy.
Mm-hmm.
And when they deal with lying, which every child is going to do at some point. The way you deal with that's going to be so critical, because we want to help them realize, we're not going to lie. You can use your family name. We're littles. We don't lie. And for us, we're Christian. We love Jesus, and loving Jesus calls us not to lie. And the reason we don't do that, because at this stage, when lying becomes an issue, that means their language skills have developed and their cognitive skills have developed to be able to handle right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now my precious mother, even in her 60s and 70s, when she made a mistake with a memory, she would often use the language, well, I lied. That wasn't. No, you didn't lie, mother. Lie means with the intent to deceive.
Sure.
So you misspoke, but you didn't lie. So some people are challenged with that definition their whole life. So we want to make sure the child knows that telling a creative story is not lying.
Yeah.
Okay, telling a creative story is not lying. But if I break something and blame it on my sister, now that's lying because I've deceived. And it gives you an opportunity to walk it through. And at the end of the conversation, you are a good boy. This is why I know you can tell the truth.
Right.
And I know that you want to stay a good boy, right? Yes, I do, Daddy. I want to stay a good boy. Well, then we're going to learn how to tell the truth.
Yeah.
And then you'll have appropriate consequences for telling lies that are there, which are different at 5 than at 16.
Oh, sure.
Those consequences are different.
Right.
As are the reasons for lying are different at 5 than they are at 16.
Yes, they are.
So Lawrence Kohlberg is going to be, and you can see that tracks a lot with the cognitive development kind of piece, although Jean Piaget also has moral development stages. The other one I want to mention is Carol Gilligan. She was one of the students of Lawrence Kohlberg. Kohlberg did all of his research with young men at Harvard University. So he was speaking primarily of upper class males at an Ivy League school. And Gilligan, one of his students, says, Doc, there are these other things like women in the world, and not everybody is an elite, and everybody has not had the opportunity to track and get admitted into Harvard. So she did some critical work, particularly with female moral development. And it tracks more on what is good for the community, what is good for the group. And this is why little girls deciding right and wrong isn't always about the rules. It's about what helps my friends. And friends are very important. So you need to be careful, dads, when you accept a job that takes your daughter out of her friendship group. You've caused a moral crisis for her. I'm not saying it's insurmountable. I just need you to make sure that you're considering your children's development.
Sure. When
you accept that job, you need to count the cost. Is it really worth the extra to accept a job? So you just consider your child's developmental place. Is this a good time for us to make this move? So a daughter that's learning the importance of friends and the role of friends, and saying things like, well, baby, you'll make new friends someplace else, doesn't help. It's true. Children are resilient. They can make new friends, but it is very challenging to do so. It's particularly challenging for dads and moms that are in the military or in working for corporations who force them to move.
Sure.
To move a lot. So Gilligan is going to be more in terms of being able to care for self, so care for others, and then what's good for the community, the friends, as opposed to what's good for me or what's good for the rule. So I think as we're caring for our children, we want to keep both in mind. We want to keep some of the rule kind of understanding. Well, we're not speeding, we're not stealing because those are rules, but also keep this, well, we're not stealing not because it's a law against it, but because that hurts people.
Yeah.
We're not wanting people just to do what's legal. We're wanting to do what's morally right.
Right.
Relationally right.
Sure.
And I think that's a piece of our culture that's been lost a little bit, particularly an individualistic culture.
Oh, sure.
I do what's right for me as opposed to some stuff.
I had a big conversation with my son, about to be 6 at this point, on being considerate of other people. And, I've bled that into just about anything and everything, even lying, and how that can cascade into issues that impact other people. But it's funny, and I'm sure other kids do this, but it's just funny to see it happen in the home where I'll have a conversation with him and then he'll carry on that same language to my daughter who's just turned 4. And he was like, Reagan, that's not very considerate of you. And she's like, she has no idea, but it's very funny.
He's practicing.
He takes it upon himself, and then he's the disciplinarian. It's fun to see that happen.
And it gives you a chance to bring up that conversation next time with him. You were right when you told your sister the other day about being considerate. Now think about what you just did.
Right. Yeah.
I think one way to wrap this up is to see our children as moving on this continuum from being very dependent on me. I'm sure all the dads listening know what it's like to bring that first child home from the hospital. Dear Lord.
Yeah.
What did I do 9 months and 3 days ago? The complete dependence that's there, and knowing that this is going to cost in multiple levels. Going from dependence, from that radical dependence of an infant, to that, watching that child grow and mature. Take pictures, write journals, have logs, have things for children to look at later. Wow, this is when you were, and this is what you did. It's going to be very important for them to know a little bit of their history through pictures, not just digital ones. You need to find ways to get some of those printed out. Artifacts, they're going to be around. We're going to move them from dependence. In their adolescent years, they're moving towards more independence when their peer groups become more important to them. Now, parents still, by and large, set the moral trajectory, but their peer groups become more important. This is where they learn about themselves in relationship with their peer groups. This is not the same as 7-year-old sleepovers. This is 15, 16-year-old behavior, you learning through peer relationships. Going from dependence to independence. I can do it, Mom. I've got it. How come I can't have the car at 2 a.m? Well, you got to create those boundaries and understanding of it, but knowing that they are learning to be independent with the goal towards interdependence. So our goal is not independence. Our goal is interdependence. But they can't get from dependence to interdependence without passing through independence. So you've instilled moral fiber, you've instilled good behavior in your children. In adolescence, there's going to be some hiccups and bouncing around. Sometimes I jokingly tell people, you just get up, get your cup of coffee, and see which kid walks down the stairs today. Is it the one who's going to be a doctor or the one that's going to go live at the beach? Because yesterday it was the doctor, the day before it was the beach. And in some families, the hair color changes every day. The behaviors is just radically different. Well, this is why you're the adult and they're not.
Sure.
They're going through a crisis. Their identity crisis is working through at this point. You have to be careful that your crisis doesn't amplify their crisis. If you're feeling unsure about who you are not going to be able to handle their insecurities about who they are. So if you're a Christian, our identity is in Christ, and knowing that if you're not a Christian, you got to make sure you find a place for your identity to be solid and secure so that when your children are going through an identity crisis, yours is solid.
Right.
Now, you can map adult development, which is perhaps conversation later, of us growing. We talk about developmental stages of children.
Sure.
Developmental stages of dads are important because they're happening parallel.
Yeah.
They're happening at the same time. But even if I am going through a crisis, because let's say dads between the ages of, say, 28 and 35 are typically going to go through an adult, somewhere in there, you're going to go through an adult male crisis. You're going to hit another one mid to late 30s. Another one's going to hit in again. The challenge is to make sure you do not overlay your stressors of change on top of your adolescent teens crisis or change. They need to experience some crisis. You can't get from independent to interdependent without figuring out a little bit of who you are.
Sure.
Now, it's always within boundaries, but figuring out who you are. So you got to give some space and don't melt down when they have a meltdown, so that then as they navigate through that, find their identity, that then they can go into interdependence. So that's kind of the big picture. We're going from dependence, radical dependence, less dependence, sheltering them, got to find out who they are in the world, to becoming interdependent later on, so they can connect back in and see their role as competent men and women in society, as leaders who don't need to keep running away from their parents.
Yeah.
So some of the language I hear of silly boomer and all these cultural motifs are rooted in lack of core identity in who they are, that they need to poke fun at and denigrate elders or denigrate children because they haven't navigated in a healthy way from dependence to interdependence to independence to interdependence. Do old people do silly things? I confess, yes, I do. However, I think that's to be celebrated and valued as opposed to be demeaned. And I would say that for every age of our children, of ourselves, of our spouses, of our parents, and those that still have great grandparents around. We're going to value every age because, well, for me as a Christian, we're all made in the image of God.
Right.
So we're going to value that toddler in the image of God. We're going to value that teenager in the image of God, even though you got to look really hard to see it from time to time. We're going to value our spouse as in the image of God. By the way, the best thing you can do for your parents, Dad, your children, Dad, is to love their mama.
Yeah.
It's the most critical piece out of all this conversation. We're talking about children developing. The most important thing that you can do for your kids is to love their mama. And creating for them a safe space in which we can care for one another, because that's where you want them to be.
Right.
In this journey, they become interdependent. They take their responsibility in providing care and receiving care in an appropriate way as adults.
Let me ask you 2 questions as we wrap this up. First question is there ever a point in which we as dads stop having some sort of a role in our child's development? Or are we essentially in some form or fashion an anchor that's always there? We might have less of a role when they're 35,
right,
but do we still have a role to play?
I made the mistake, and I don't know where I got it, but growing up as a dad, I thought my job would end when they were 18. When I was 18, for crying out loud, I graduated from junior college at 18.
Yeah.
And I got married at 18. And I had kids by the time I was 20 when I graduated from college with my bachelor's degree in teaching school. So I had this idea that if I just get my kids to 18, no, that's not true. We have a lifelong. But I think what we do is we move, our identity moves in this process. I'm still me, but I move into the more sage. So dads that have toddlers today, 5, 7-year-olds or teenagers today, look forward to the time when you're the sage. Be willing to tell stories. Be willing to remember. Be willing to say, I think I did a good job here. I blew it there. I didn't understand that. But, life is good.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
My parents both passed away a couple of years ago. 3 years ago for my mother this last month, and my dad 2.5 years ago. In a way, they still have parenting pieces in my life. The day anniversary of my mother's passing last month, wanted to give her a call. One of my brothers lives in my parents' house, and they still have the same phone number. I was tempted to call him on his landline so I could use Mom's phone number.
Wow. But
there's a sense in which my parents' core strengths continue to inform me. In a similar way, my mother and dad's weaknesses, which we all have them. Our goal isn't to be perfect, nor to raise perfect children, but to acknowledge what our weaknesses are and know that I need other people to help me in those weaknesses.
Yeah.
I still am informed by my mom and dad's strengths and by their weaknesses. So even after you're gone, your dad job's not.
So we say you're always a dad. As soon as it happens.
Your dad's job's not
gone,
done. I have a picture on my camera of my parents' tombstone, and behind that I can see, or next to that is my grandparents, and behind that is my great-grandparents. I even have a great-great-grandfather buried, within camera shot of this spot in southern Missouri. So there's a sense in which that snapshot, even though my grandparent had less impact, there's still a sense in which there's continuity. I can see where my dad's work ethic came from, my grandfather. I can see where his compassion came from, his mother. I can see some adaptability and flexibility. I see some willingness to do whatever I need to do to make sure my family's cared for.
Wow.
And I pray that I've lived that out in my own life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we all have that same prayer. Okay, good to know. Good to verify and validate that we are always fathers.
But we don't have to carry responsibility then. That's if I could be transparent now, that's one of the challenges I have is how do I get to the place making sure that if my grandchildren or my adult children, as I mentioned, my oldest one's 41, as they're going through a crisis, how can I be a sage, knowing when to listen, when to talk, and not carry the pain of their suffering? How can I be empathetic without being traumatized?
Sure.
And that's going to be a critical piece, not for you now, but for later. And as you're willing to share your ups and downs with your parents, how can you tell the story in a way that you're asking for their sage perspectives without dumping your crisis on them? Asking a dad of your age asking a dad my age how to set this up, I would say that's one thing you need to do to set that stage up. And I think it starts, even as dad, starts for us as our children are young.
Yeah.
So that, yes, I'm more responsible. However, I can't feel every pain to the level that they're feeling. I need to be empathetic without being traumatized.
Yeah.
Because if I'm traumatized, now I'm not able to be dad.
Sure. That's good. I imagine that's a difficult thing to separate as well.
It is. But we need to start it when your kids are 6 and 4. Yes, you hurt your finger. And yes, you got in trouble at school. And yes, you were bullied. And we'll talk about that and we'll work our way through it. But we have to be secure in who we are so that we're not traumatized by that, or we will overreact. This is where abuse can come in. Or workaholic behaviors to avoid my dad responsibilities. There's lots of ways to avoid. Bottles are ways to avoid. Lots of ways to avoid, but it frequently comes because I'm having trouble empathizing without being traumatized.
Yeah.
So I have to step away. And you don't want to do that. You want to be an engaged dad.
Sure.
And I think that's a key element of this podcast series.
Absolutely.
How can I be an engaged dad? Well, to be an engaged dad, I need to be growing and maturing myself.
Right.
So I'm available as a person can hear. Person can have a conversation. Person can act when I need to. That's one of the gifts of dads. And I do believe there are gender differences between moms and dads.
Sure, absolutely.
I think that's one of the differences between dads. Sometimes we can think a little more analytically and we can act a little more quickly.
Yeah.
Now, we need our wives to help us moderate through the process. But I have to be careful that I'm able to do that and not be traumatized by it, because I can't be dad if I turn into a puddle on the floor.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned, hurting the finger. My dad always told me growing up, it will feel better when it quits hurting. That's what he always told me. Thanks, Dad. Appreciate that sage advice. All right. Last question that I have for you. So I learned a little bit more than what I knew, which wasn't much to begin with, but dealing with the varying domains of development that our children go through. There's clearly some overlapping that happens with these domains, which can present a unique challenge, I would imagine. But from what little I know on the topic, I've read a lot and seen a lot that indicates that there are some really formative developmental phases that happen from the 5 to 8, 8 to 12 year span. Clearly, after this discussion, as fathers, we need to be involved through every phase. And I don't know that it would be a good idea to maybe put more of an emphasis on one phase than the other. But I'm going to ask you the question anyway. Is it more important, not that we should be like, okay, I'm going to be super dad when they're 6 to 9, and then when they're a teenager,
I'm out of here.
I'm hitting my yacht and I'm gone. But still be engaged. But is there a span within our child's development that we need to be maybe extra intentional in?
I would say it's more like it shifts and changes. There's lots of work on studies on how critical the first 2 years are, and setting some of those foundational pieces cognitively, physically, interactive, socially. A lot of people, there's a whole field of psychology called personality theory that talks about most of that is set by 2. So that's critical period, setting some things up. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the adolescent period, they are going through trauma. And if you're not there, so it's a different kind of there. It's a different expectation. So I think it's not of when and do I really need to pay attention. It's how do I pay attention differently.
I see.
And part of the tragedy is I jokingly tell people when I'm doing parenting classes, I really learned what 5-year-olds need. Only problem is my youngest one was 8 when I figured that out. So knowing that I have to be flexible and watching and being aware of those shifts and changes, and knowing, if I have a teenage child and an 8-year-old, I have to be present, but I'm present in 2 different ways.
Sure.
Because most of us, unless you have just an only child or you just have twins and you said that's it,
Yeah.
most of us have kids that are at times in two different places.
Sure.
So we're going to be present for those two children, but we're going to be present in different ways. What they need from us as they're navigating, to use Erickson's stuff, as they're navigating their crisis, what they're developing, then they need a different kind of dad, different kind of coach, different kind of mentoring, different kind of grieving when they fail. Some of the greatest learning comes from failure.
Absolutely, it does.
And how do we create space where we would rather have you fail than do nothing? And what does it look like to have a dad that can help a child fail at 7 is different than a dad that finds out that his son got the neighbor's daughter pregnant at 17. Neither one of those are the end of the world.
Sure.
They can become the end of the world if I am rejected and my identity is trashed with the tragedy that happened at 7,
exactly,
tragedy that happened at 17. We have to make sure that we are present, but it's going to shift. I don't think there's one spot where it's most important. We need to be present.
Yes, absolutely. You said something that sparked one more question. I know I've held you for too long, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I appreciate our time together. So you mentioned, you figured out what a 5-year-old needs when your child's 8. So with families, which I think would be a decent majority of families, at least here in America and probably around the world, but you have multiple children.
Right.
Now you have your oldest child and then you have your second child. And usually, I know that this is true with friends of mine who grew up in families of 3 and 4 and maybe more, but the youngest child gets such a different treatment. Yeah. And some of that might be due to various reasons, but some of it might also be due to the fact that as a parent, they just figured out a better or different way or a different approach for that 3rd or 4th or 5th child. So you please just give a short answer for this if it's possible, shortest you can do. But how should we as fathers be aware of that? And what should we do to try and prevent tension with the kids?
Tension is going to happen. So tension prevention is not an appropriate goal, I don't think.
Tension mitigation.
Tension mitigation is far better. Because if our goal is tension prevention, then if you have 3 kids, we probably should have 3 houses in 3 different states. We actually want them to learn through the tension.
Sure.
Because they're going to have to go to work. And where are you going to find a job that has no tension? I don't know. Yeah. There's not one.
Right.
So there are skills that they're learning even through the tension. So I think the key is having a clear awareness of what our moral fiber is for our family. We're going to treat people with respect. We're going to love others. We're going to serve others. So having an opportunity for the family to be on a service project someplace else, because families which are insular, only looking inward, are going to create selfish families. So if you can, from an early age, now homeless people need dinners times other than Thanksgiving. So it's amazing how many soup kitchens have volunteers on Thanksgiving, but a random Tuesday in February, nobody's interested.
Sure.
So find ways to be of service to others. The second piece of that is to realize that 4th child was born into a family that had 3 kids. First child was born into a completely different family. That family had no kids.
Right.
I'm a firstborn. My little brother, the one with the doctorate in music, he's 10 years younger than I am, and we have 2 brothers in between. I was born into a family with just a mom and dad. He was born into a family with a 10-year-old brother and two other. It's a different family.
Sure.
It may look the same name, it's different. So if we have a growing consistency in our moral fiber, and for me as a Christian, my role as a disciple, including service to others and loving others in the name of Christ. If my worship at home is as faithful or more faithful than my worship on Sunday, now I've mitigated the tension. I've used the tension in a creative way. Because when the crisis comes up, I know where my resources are, and I can keep bringing them into the discussion. Was it harder on you for the firstborn? Probably. Does Junior, the third one down, get a little bit easier? It may have. But life is kind of that way. What are the gifts that you have? How do we maximize your giftings, your possibilities, and how do we help identify your weaknesses and know where you need people to help you along the way? So if you, again, born into different families, be consistent in relationship with other elements of society, and thirdly, having a core value system that guides things, because stuff changes over time.
Absolutely.
Values need to be those. For me, it's the three that abide forever: faith, hope, and love.
Right.
Those abide forever. So I'm going to keep coming back to those. And even though at 61, hope looks different than it did at 31, I need to make sure I'm living out of faith, hope, and love.
Right. And I imagine that even if those still don't quite mitigate the tension the way that you would hope that it does, by the time your children actually have kids, they'll probably get the revelation themselves. Like, oh, this is why Dad did what he did. Dad, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to be mad at you all these years. Okay. Well, I think that this has been a super informative episode. You've provided a lot. This is definitely one of those. Go back and listen to it 3 and 4 times and flag it, because as your kids get older, keep going back and listening to it as they continue to develop. And you provided a bunch of resources and individuals to gather information from. So I appreciate that as well. Well, I've got no other questions. I'm not going to throw anything else at you. I appreciate your time as always. And I look forward to the next time I can get you back on the podcast.
My pleasure, and thank you for the invitation, and the competent dads that are listening, because they have the skills necessary to care for the ones that the Lord's put in their hands.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. This is Fathering Our Future, the podcast for dads. I'm Anthony Vandegrift, and I hope you'll join me next time. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, don't be shy. Please connect with Fathering Our Future on social media and become a part of the community that values fathers, that aims to help men love being dads, and to help dads be better dads every day, so that together we can better father our future.